All right, so to recap, the reason I'm doing this is because I've been dealing with some health problems that have been creating some memory issues, and I don't want to lose who I am. So we'll start at the beginning of my life. I was born 1993 in West Jordan, Utah, to Dave and Dana Deard. Dave grew up in Montana, Billings, Montana, and my mom grew up in Idaho. Mom was a farmer, dad was they were both from small towns, basically. And my mom was kind of raised by potato farmers, and my dad was raised by, you know, mountain ranchers. So they're kind of just, I want to say old school, but also like really wholesome and country. You know what I mean? I went to Oker Elementary School, and we lived in West Jordan from when I was born until about 2005. In 2005, we moved to Harriman, Utah. The city was just, the Salt Lake Valley just keeps expanding and expanding and expanding. And when my folks moved to West Jordan, it was kind of quiet, but they built strip mall right next to where I grew up, and so it was, time to move on. My dad had just gotten a new job where he could afford a lot more. Basically, we went from being pretty poor to being, you know, kind of in the middle class. So we went from, I mean, a lot of people would have considered it poverty, right? My dad was working. He managed two restaurants simultaneously for a while just so that he could afford to pay the bills. And my mom also worked cutting hair at Great Clips. So my mom was gone cutting hair, and my dad was gone managing two different restaurants just so that he could, stay afloat. Four boys, and I'm the youngest of four boys. That was probably pretty expensive for people who were, blue collar like that. But my dad got a new job for Franklin Covey, I think it was, and he was teaching real estate investment. And he started out just like selling those like real estate classes to people, but then he learned really a ton about it and began coaching people in how to make money in real estate, doing like fix and flips and maintaining rental properties and how to, shelter assets and things like that, right? So my dad learned so much about that he started teaching it, and he was making pretty good money for a while there. And that's what happened with my dad, right? And that allowed us to move, right? So, by this point, two of my brothers had moved out of the house, and so it was just me and my brother Dustin, who's closest to me in age. He's about 4 years older than me. We grew up. Dustin still had a big attachment to where we moved from, so he wanted to go to high school at Copper Hills High School because that's where my other brothers went, right? And so my brother would commute to Copper Hills because that's where all of his friends were and things like that. And he was not doing well at Riverton High, which is the high school where we were. Harriman didn't have its own high school back then. It was a little further out, and the city hadn't enveloped it yet. So basically, he would go to Copper Hills when we first moved there because he, and I was getting in trouble because I was struggling to fit in with the people there. It was a different culture. I moved from pretty low on the socioeconomic spectrum to somewhere in the middle, and it was extremely difficult to identify how to fit in there. There were really great people growing up as kids that were super welcoming and nice, but I just I didn't know the culture and how to fit in. So I struggled in middle school. I got in a lot of trouble because I didn't have any of the people that came up with me through elementary school, And so I got in a lot of trouble, and I got kind of to a point where it was like, all right, if I continued down that same course I was on, I was going to have a lot of problems, juvie and all that kind of crap. Because I was, I was a menace to society, and so I, when ninth grade was starting, I found a little charter school called Paradigm High School. And at the time, it was in two warehouses in Sandy, so we had to like carpool to get there. But the principles that it was founded on were really awesome. Jeffersonian education. It was kind of built on sort of the principles of the same principles that like George Wythe College down in central Utah was based off of. It was a liberal arts education, taught you more about how to think and things like that. So it was a very beneficial place for me to be. The challenge that I run into a lot of times is that Paradigm's social structure was very different from a normal school. There wasn't really like popular kids, unpopular kids. It was kind of like a small town. Everybody was just them, right? And everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew each other's families back then at that school because it was so small. And I loved it. I got along really well, and the philosophies that I was learning in school were deeply impactful and fascinating to me. So I dove right in. The school was chartered for leadership, and we studied a lot of the philosophies of the founding fathers and the philosophies of the people that helped influence the founding fathers of our country. So I grew up with a very unique educational background that focused in a lot on that. Like instead of for math, we didn't just like, here's a formula, here's how it works. It was like, well, here's how Euclid arrived at the conclusion that this is how functional geometry works. So we would read things like Euclid as part of our mathematics curriculum, right? So it was deeply fascinating and very different from what most people experience in their educational background. And I just flourished, right? Because I had the opportunity to be given that freedom where I wasn't sit in a class and we're going to teach you things and you're going to memorize them and you're going to spit them back. It was like a journey of growth and expansion and learning and building that, line upon line knowledge, right? I have, base foundation. This is how to read. This is how to write. These are some of the greats who have done really good at reading and writing, and this is how you can learn from them. And this is how they arrived at their conclusions. And so you go through that process of logic, the same way that these, influential people like Newton and Leibniz went through their logical progression. And it teaches you a lot more about how to critically think and process things. And it's a lot more about how to think instead of what to think. And so instead of just memorizing facts and spitting them back, which was just like torture to me growing up, I had the opportunity to actually exercise my analytical thinking and processes of logic. And that to me was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. I started doing well in school. I started making friends in school, and I was no longer that menace, right? And so that was a big shift in my life. A big part of my life growing up was the Boy Scouts. My dad had a big regret that he didn't have the opportunity to earn his Eagle. He quit as a Life Scout and didn't earn his Eagle. And for him, he thought everyone needed to earn their Eagle because it teaches you so many valuable skills. I mean, in the scouting program, I learned knot tying, shotgun shooting, rifle shooting, archery, wilderness survival, a lot of very, very beneficial survival skills. And so learning all of those skills as a young man was very impactful and beneficial to me. And it helped me so much in my career in the military, right? I got to basic training and everyone was miserable. They hated it. And you know what? It to me, it was like Boy Scout camp, except you got people yelling at you. That's really the only difference. You got people yelling at you and you do a hell of a lot more push-ups, but all in all, it's the same exact thing as Boy Scout camp. All of their curriculum they teach you at basic training, land navigation, that's just orienteering merit badge a second time. And I had already done that by the time I was 14. So this was really easy for me, right? So I did well in basic training. And obviously the physical part sucked because that sucks for everyone, right? You have to exercise a lot and it's hard on the body when you're not used to it. I went from playing video games all day, and reading books all day as a nerd. I loved the great books of the Western world. Britannica set of the great books from the Western world was like my big educational thing growing up. I would study topically through all of those. It's a 54 volume set of basically the encyclopedias of Western philosophy and ideas and the foundational principles that we in the Western society are built on. The principles of just governance, like, if you read through all of them, Hobbes, Locke, even back into Rome and Greece, their philosophies of the people having a say in their government is kind of a big foundational principle of Western society. And it all started with how we view the world. And that all comes from our morals, our philosophies, our ethics, and our virtues that are all kind of unfolded throughout that set of books, right? And so being able to see it not only chronologically but also topically, being able to study each of the big profound ideas was huge to me, and I loved it. And so that was a huge part of what I studied out of growing up. And anyway, wow, I got on a big rant about some other thing. I was talking about the scouting program and how it helped me and how much I learned. Boy Scouts were amazing. I did well in there. And the new area we moved to had, I think, a different outlook on scouting, right? When I was at in the old area, the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, there's a lot of resistance, a lot of like, my parents are forcing me to be here, so I don't want to do it, or, that rebellion, right? When I was in this new area, there wasn't that rebellion. The kids wanted to be there, and the people wanting to be there makes a big difference. And so when those guys are wanting to be where they are and actively pursuing their Eagle Scout and trying to meet goals, it's a huge example, right? There were a couple kids growing up that, they had some stuff going on in their life that sucked. But despite that, they were able to go to the Scouts and, get away from maybe family life problems and focus on themselves and focus on learning new skills and nature and how to do amazing things. So I thought it was great. So I was molded by that a lot. And, there's some people that I would be remiss without mentioning, how great of an example they were to me. There's a kid who lived across the street from me, Daniel Bueller, and his older brother, Mike Bueller. They were both very much the same as my family, right? But they were just, a year or two ahead of me, and they'd moved from a lower part of the socioeconomic spectrum into middle class, probably a year or so prior to me, and they had really started to flourish. And I was, at that same time, kind of going through that same sort of metamorphosis. And so the Buellers were a huge example of me. And the Case family were also. Preston Case, the same age as me, and his older brother Alex Case, both amazing kids. And they, you could tell that they had that a little bit of hesitance and rebellion in them, where their parents were forcing them to do it and they didn't really want to do it, but they did it anyway. And they, despite not wanting to learn to love it, and were sharing the stuff that they had learned with me. Like I never would have done like Order of the Arrow if it weren't for Preston Case doing Order of the Arrow and me being able to learn about that. And to me, it was special because my grandma on my dad's side, Juanita, she grew up on the Spokane reservation, and she was, had some ties to her Native American heritage that I didn't get the opportunity to learn from her very much, and so doing Order of the Arrow gave me some way of learning some things about Native American traditions, and connecting a little bit with my heritage. I know I'm white, blue eyes, all that, but yeah, my grandma was not, and you know, I miss that I didn't get that opportunity to learn that. And so doing that as a kid gave me the opportunity to learn some and connect some to my heritage. And I thought that was great. So this is like the first part of my life, like a broad picture. But those things are the most impactful to me. Learning to love learning and learning to enjoy the opportunities that I had at a chartered school that had a vastly different culture. I mean, like, here's an example. Normally, you have like football, basketball teams, and like that. We had a fencing team and we did martial arts. So, fencing and martial arts were my PT classes, right? PE, I mean. So, for our physical education, yeah, we learned about team sports because it's part of the state's required curriculum, right? But outside of just going out and playing some of those, most of our actual like physical education was understanding how things work, right? Like how our bodies function and how exercising, has such beneficial impacts on our brain and all those other things, right? And it was also doing fun things that we enjoyed. And a big one that, I mean, the most, you know, highly booked classes at that time in the school were like fencing and taekwondo, right? So I did, taekwondo through the school and fencing, and it was great. It was different from what most schools do, right? And if you didn't want to be in class, all right, don't be in class. So they, at the time, it was very relaxed on its attendance policy, right? And that was vastly different because if you're only there because you want to be there and not there because you're forced to be there, mandated by the state or whatever, then your outlook is so different, right? And so, yeah, there were people who would, skip classes or whatever at school. And don't get me wrong, I was one of them. I would skip classes all the time, but you'd always find me out in the hall having some deep philosophical discussion with, somebody at the school, like Joseph Bjork or Joseph Fisher or, Diggory Ells, were some of these guys that were just like a couple of years ahead of me in school, had learned about some really crazy philosophies that I was just learning about myself. And we were discussing the different ideologies that existed and what their impact is on civilization and society. And so despite not being actually in the class that I was, assigned to at that time, I was still actively growing and learning and pursuing knowledge. And to me, that was the best thing for my education. So I loved that a lot. But yeah, there's just a lot there in my upbringing that was different, right? I recall just not going to school for like a month one time, and then the school was like, "What's going on? You do actually have to show up sometimes, right? Like they have rules, right? There's laws, truancy or whatever." And so I recall talking to my teachers, and I was like, "Well, I'm going, hunting with my family. I'm going to use some wilderness survival skills if I just do this project and write sort of like a long paper about it. Can I use that as sort of like a project that is a multidisciplinary project? Because English for writing, I went through and physical sciences, like as far as like learning about earth sciences and stuff. There was a vast amount of geology where we were going up hunting and stuff like that. And so I was able to write and do this kind of like project in lieu of attending school for like a whole month because I just was like, what's the point in going there? I was really into this like hunting thing because our family we had a tradition growing up. Once a year, every October, we'd go with my Uncle Jay and, well, all my family. We called Jay set up the camp for us, really, but every year we'd go up and we'd go hunt elk as a family. And that was kind of like our meat source for the year was going up hunting with them. And we would butcher the elk ourselves. So we would kill it, prep it, clean it, and butcher it all ourselves. And then, so that taught me a lot about anatomy and a lot about how to take care of ourselves and be self-sufficient, right? I think as a country, we've done a disservice to ourselves by moving away from self-reliance as a people and more toward, communalism and things like that. There are great infrastructure. The infrastructure our country has is amazing, and those communal welfare programs are great for that. But the whole is a sum of its parts, and when we have a sum of people who rely on the government or rely on a community to take care of their needs, then they don't have the capacity to be the strong, independent country that we have built ourselves as. And so, anyway, that's a long story. It's a whole nother rant. But learning self-reliance as a youth growing up was extremely important to who I have become. So I think the biggest, most profound things in my life, as a quick recap, were moving away from where I grew up, kind of starting fresh, starting new, being exposed to people who wanted to be where they were and had that internal drive and were a good example to me. Going through the scouting program and learning so many valuable skills and being able to do things when I was, when I was a teenager, I could do things that a lot of adults were very unsure of how to do. I worked on my own cars growing up. My brothers and my dad taught me how to work on all of our cars. And so, I could rebuild an engine if I needed to by the time I was, a teenager. And mind you, this is before we had YouTube to just look this crap up on. Like, I legitimately had an understanding of how automobiles worked. And that taught me another very valuable lesson, and that is understanding how everything works makes a way deeper impact on your capacity to function within that system. So knowing what components go into a smartphone and how they work makes you understand how to operate your smartphone a lot better. Understanding how computers are built, which Cameron, my oldest brother, he taught me how to build a computer when I was like 11, I think, 11 or 12. I was building computers out of like scrap parts, So my first computer that I ever had that was like my computer was there. I didn't have a case for it. So it was like a motherboard and RAM and hard drive that I had like screwed into a piece of plywood because I didn't have an actual case for it and just like hung on the wall. So it was just like an open face computer hung on plywood on the wall. That was my computer. And then I had it plugged into a monitor, and that was it, right? And my brother taught me how to do that. That was like skills that you just wouldn't get without growing up in an environment that had so much thirst for knowledge. And so that's just how I grew up, and I loved it. So anyway, scouting, moving, Paradigm High School, like those were the biggest influential things in my young life before I had decided to go down the path of my military career. And when I was working at Wells Fargo as a banker coach, I think at the time, I was teaching phone bankers how to do banking and all the regulations, because banking is very heavily federally regulated because banks have insurance from the FDIC, right? And so we learned a ton of stuff there. Gosh. But during my time there, I couldn't fathom continuing on that as my career. So I ended up joining the military. Before that, I had served a 2-year mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I was raised LDS. You could have guessed. I'm from Utah. That's pretty much the norm there. And I served a mission in the Missouri St. Louis mission for 2 years. I wouldn't take it back for the world. It was an amazing time. When you spend 2 years of your life doing nothing but like serving the community and helping those around you and trying to deepen their faith and their relationship with their God is amazing, right? So that was great. But yeah, I came back from my mission and started working in banking, and I couldn't fathom being stuck behind a desk the rest of my life. And so I joined the military. I did a bunch of research and I was like, okay, the best way to get school paid for and the best way to do all this stuff is going to be to join the National Guard. But as a kid, I really wanted to be a Green Beret. And so I was trying to figure out how I could do both. So what I did is I joined the 19th Special Forces Group with the intention of going to selection and getting a Green Beret. When I got back from basic training, I started having some health problems. Totally unrelated from the health problems I'm having now. But I couldn't pass a PT test to save my life, and I couldn't figure out why. And they found out later that I had some shit growing in my colon. So they removed a little bit of cancer from my colon, and that was a huge drain on my energy. And once they pulled that out, I was passing PT tests, I was kicking ass, but I just wasn't in the right place in my life to go to selection. So I was getting ready. I was getting ready to challenge the rec when I started having health problems. The Readiness Enhancement Company is what the Utah National Guard uses. Well, what the National Guard Special Forces uses in order to do kind of like a SFRE is what they call it, but it's like a pre-selection training organization. And if you can pass the Readiness Enhancement Company, then they'll send you to selection. I failed the rec, and so anyway, I couldn't do that at that time. And I'll follow up later with my second attempt, which was recently when I got deployed. I was going to use this deployment to get physically fit to challenge the rec again and go and get my Green Beret finally. But unfortunately, I guess God had a different plan for me. The fates didn't agree. The stars did not align.